What's going on, everybody? I'm back with another video. This video is going to be looking at the game between France and Portugal. Now, the defining phase in this game, I believe, was Portugal's defensive phase because they had a lot going on, a lot of different changes, and France had a lot of opportunity to exploit this had they done things just a little differently. But before we start, be sure to check out my book. There's a link in the description below, as well as the link to Keyframe, which is how I make this video. So be sure to check out the description for those links, and let's get right into it. So Portugal in their high block went with a 4-3-3. They staggered their midfield a little bit off center so they had access to the wide areas because France played with very wide fullbacks. And then here we see a bit of an asymmetric back four with one of their left fullbacks jumping. So by doing so, they relieve some of the pressure put on the wingers of Portugal because of the advanced wide fullbacks of France. So if Portugal didn't have one of their fullbacks jump with the asymmetric midfield three, then the wingers would be exposed and have to defend across a very wide area. As we see here, the wingers no longer have access to the fullbacks and central defenders who they're responsible for pressing. So now France in their build-up phase split their two center backs with their goalkeeper, played with a double pivot, and played with more two central players as well as a more natural number 10. Or we could look at these as inverted wingers, a narrow front three with then wide fullbacks. So what this did is it gave them a natural number 10, which then Portugal looked to match up with man orientation with their two advanced midfielders, one occupying the double pivot with Cristiano Ronaldo, the other fading into the wide area. And then on the weak side, this was countered with our jumping fullback, as we mentioned earlier. So the one thing to note in France's offensive setup from the start, they didn't have much occupation in the half space, which we have highlighted here. So without any real influence, we see no French players between the lines in the half space, and then the same will be true on this weak side. So without this, it becomes much easier to defend, and typically if you don't have access within the half spaces, you then have a greater distance of connections between your offensive structure. When Portugal would move into the midfield third, they would play in a more 4-5-1 formation, with then their wingers dropping a little bit deeper. Also, a little bit due to the height of the fullbacks of the French side in the mid-block, France used a bit more narrow fullbacks in the midfield third, but they still went with their double pivot. And now we start to see more occupation of the half spaces with their narrow front three, Karim Benzema playing as the 9 and creating dual width on either side, allowing these wingers to then come inside into more dangerous positions, occupying space between the block, but still holding width. And one thing I was surprised the fullbacks didn't do was vary their positioning a little bit more, because a lot of times, as we see here, they were very flat and didn't occupy much height. But when it was dual width, it made sense because it allowed movement to be freed up. When they had the double pivot staying a bit deeper and the winger would advance, I figured this would be a cue for the fullback to also advance, but in the midfield third it didn't quite happen like that. Then as we move a little bit deeper, not quite in the low block, but a little bit deeper than the mid block, we create a back five with the Portuguese defensive shape. One of the wide midfielders would drop into the defensive line. The midfield would become more staggered, and Ronaldo would still be the lone striker looking for a transition. But France's offensive setup didn't change much other than the advancing fullbacks they had. Now their fullbacks played a little bit higher up the field, but still with the narrow front three. But with the advancing fullbacks, this is what forced the Portuguese midfielder to drop and create a back five. And we even start to see a 2-3 rest defense as France played with two central defenders. They then had their double pivot and their other midfielders occupy the space in front of their two central defenders, preparing for transition, while the height and width was being created through their fullbacks. So now when Portugal did drop in their low block, oftentimes both their wide midfielders would then drop in their defensive line now, So this would create a 6-3-1 shape, which would allow the central three midfielders of Portugal to then shift across and occupy the central corridors, and it gave them more access to the wide areas in their defensive line. So with their fullbacks of France advancing, it gave the Portugal widest defenders better access to then pressure these areas and not let them progress around the defensive line. The France 4-3 then became very narrow to then get inside the box and make dangerous runs or threaten in behind. The double pivot was still in place with a staggering number 10 and 2 central defenders. And with such deep defending from Portugal, the defensive transition wasn't as hard to control because of so many Portuguese players committed to the last line of defense. When Portugal were in possession of the ball, they built similarly to France, but instead of a double pivot, they had a single pivot with a more natural 8, playing a little more box to box, but often had 2 attacking midfielders. But they again played quite narrow, which then emphasized the space in the half space, which wasn't really utilized, I don't think, by either team, and dual width was created on both sides of the field. A little staggering going on, but for the most part, the dual width was a trend for both teams. France would play a 4-4-2 to try and counter this, and one trend I noticed in the defensive phase for a few different teams in the Euro so far was a lot of times the defensive shape often becomes very linear in these teams. So a lot of times players on the same vertical line, they don't do a good enough job staggering themselves, and we see this in many different situations. But what this does is it creates a lot of space between the players to then allow the offensive team more space than necessary to attack through. So this is one thing that we can tell we want to avoid, this vertical alignment of our defenders, because it's not very efficient when it comes to spatial control. Now the last picture here before we wrap up the analysis is France and their mid block, and we could call it a 4-5-1 or a 4-4-2 depending if we pair the number 10 with our forward or if we count him part of the midfield line. But if we continue on with the France 4-4-2, we can then outline the Portugal 4-3-3 shape, still going with dual width but varying the space that our fullbacks occupy. On the strong side, we have our fullback occupying a more narrow position. On the weak side, he's occupying a wider position, and then the trend continues, one winger occupying a wider position and then the other occupying a more narrow. So I like this setup a little bit better from Portugal because it gives them more access from multiple players into the half space between the lines, and it gives them more central passing options to disrupt the France defense. It also creates a possibility to create 2v1s, as we see here, against the French fullback. So by doing so, they can better access the space in behind and take advantage of this. So that's the analysis, guys. Hope everyone enjoyed it. Like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one.